Imagine hearing a call that promises both salvation for your soul and glory for your name. You leave your quiet fields behind, sew a cross onto your tunic, and march east toward lands you've never seen. The call that began at Clermont in 1095. But soon the journey strips away illusions. Fear grows. Battles strike harder than the sermons prepared you for, and the weight of faith feels heavier than the steel blade at your side. What you expect and what you will live through will not be the same. So let us begin where that call first reached you. Imagine this. You stand in the chill of late autumn, the sky heavy and gray, the earth bare after harvest. Your life has been one of repetition, plowing soil, tending animals, kneeling in the same chapel each week. Hunger shadows each winter, and work grinds on from dawn to dusk. Then word arrives from distant Clermont, where Pope Urban II spoke in November of 1095. His appeal promised that anyone who died on this armed pilgrimage would gain remission of sins. That sermon, once only words, now feels like a bell rung for you. At first it sounds strange. How can taking up arms be the road to heaven? Yet priests and traveling preachers carry the message with pressing urgency. They say sin presses heavily on every soul, and a path eastward offers its release. Reform has been stirring in the church, part of the Gregorian effort to demand stricter devotion. Now that reform takes new form, not only fasting and prayer, but an armed pilgrimage, the violence of knights redirected toward a cause proclaimed holy. What was once distant rumor now moves quickly into villages and markets, turning talk from crops to holy Jerusalem. The promise is bright, but it unsettles you too. To march east means leaving farm and family at risk. A field left untilled may starve a household. A village without its fighters stands weaker before danger. And yet against those risks looms something heavier. The possibility of eternal loss if you ignore the Pope's call. It feels less like an abstract idea and more like a decision pressing in with every passing day. Soon you see neighbors at cramped tables, cutting cloth and sewing crosses onto their tunics. The act is simple, but it marks a public vow visible to all. Some stitch eagerly, as if already purified. Others hesitate, urged forward by family or the eyes of their peers. Motives are mixed. Some go out of piety, others from fear of shame, others to settle debts or seek fortune. No single reason explains the swell of men and women who answer. What matters is that the cross, once a symbol in prayer, becomes stitched into daily life, a sign of expectation that binds. The air in these weeks feels charged. Priests preach more often, and their words bite sharper than before. Bells ring not only to call to worship, but to announce new gatherings, where villagers are urged to remember Jerusalem and the sacred sites now held by foreign hands. It spreads like fire, this feeling that heaven's gates will open only to those who take the long road east with sword as their staff. Your mind drifts between dread and longing. Nights grow restless. You imagine the gaze of God measuring hesitation. What if you let this single chance pass? The sermons weigh sin against salvation so heavily, it seems your soul itself might drag you down if left unpurged. But the thought of death gnaws too, whispering that your body may not last the journey. The path shines with both promise and terror, each possibility tied to the same decision. When the cross presses against your chest, it feels like a token of strength. For a moment, it stiffens the spine, as neighbors now see you branded a pilgrim, enlisted in Christ's cause. Yet there is burden, too. Each thread binds your life to a vow that may carry you far from home or into the grave. A scratch of cloth may seem small, but it rubs as a reminder that you no longer belong wholly to your old self. Then the morning comes when you tighten belt and pack and step beyond your hearth. Villagers walk with you to the edge of the fields, some blessing, some weeping, others staring with unease. You glance back at land shaped by your own hands, and each step forward feels heavier than the last. Still, the crowd urges onward, and the tide of bodies draws you with it. The smell of wood smoke fades as you move farther from the homes you know. Soil that clung to your boots gives way to open roads bearing east. The songs of worship mingle with sobs of parting, and over it all, the words spoken at Clermont still ring, urging you to keep marching toward salvation, toward glory, toward a destiny none can clearly see. This is the weight of taking the cross, carrying your fears, your family's hopes, and the bindings of faith stitched into your very clothing. You step away from certainty into distance. What waits is not triumph at the first bend, but the long road itself, each mile already testing the vow you've made. The march east begins not in triumph, but in hardship. From the first days, hunger and thirst press heavier than the weight of armor. You soon learn that the enemy is not only across the horizon, but beneath your feet. Each mile of mud, dust, and stone testing the body long before steel is drawn. Everywhere you look, the road is crowded. Knights on horseback jostle beside peasants dragging ox carts stacked with bedding and pots. Children cry, animals stumble, tempers flare when wagons tip and block the path for hours. Some crusaders take the overland routes through the Balkans. Others sail from Italian ports. Yet all are bound toward the same beacon, Constantinople, where leaders and troops begin to gather between late 1096 and spring of 1097. At first, hymns echo along the march. For a little while, the shared singing lifts feet across muddy fields and steep passes. But the songs fade. What remains is silence broken by boots squelching in wet tracks and the groans of men favoring blistered feet. Leather splits at the seams. Toes bleed. Water skins hang cracked and empty. Those who cannot keep pace fall back, swallowed by the miles. Fires at night bring weak relief. Smoke curls over damp tents. Bowls of thin stew pass too quickly from hand to hand, and suspicion lingers in the shadows. Hungry men eye one another across glowing embers. Whispers shift blame, cursing rival lords for poor planning or locals for high prices. Sometimes patience snaps, and a village's stores vanish overnight. Pillage leaves barns bare, peasants fleeing in panic. These acts feed the army in the short term, but they also spark retaliation. Some groups, stripped of order after looting in Anatolia, meet Turkish ambushes and are destroyed in the open fields. You begin to see how fragile discipline can be. Crusaders swore vows before the cross, but here hunger speaks more loudly than sermons. Priests try to bind morale together with processions, calling men to join barefoot circles of prayer, voices cracking into the night. Others turn to penance, whipping themselves to call down mercy. You may join them, pressing knees onto cold ground, clutching beads, waiting for faith to ease the gnawing in your belly. Still, doubt creeps in. The sacred words of home compete with the stench of sweat and fever. The land shifts around you, sometimes baked plains where heat burns through armor and animals stagger, ribs shining beneath hide. Other times, rains pour until the ground becomes a sucking trap, carts sinking axle deep. When oxen collapse, wagons are abandoned along the road, baggage scattered and left behind. You take hold of what you can, shouldering burdens until your arms quake, then letting go as others have, walking forward lighter yet haunted by loss. Disease gnaws at the column. At night you hear the cries of parents as sickness takes a child. Corpses lie in shallow ditches along the roadside, a grim reminder of how little protection vows provide. Death enters not with battle, but with coughing lungs and starving bellies. You whisper prayers, though at times they sound like echoes swallowed by the dark. Amid this suffering rides a shadowed memory. Months earlier in Anatolia, thousands from the so-called People's Crusade had already been annihilated at Sivto. The tale spreads from mouth to mouth as a warning. The road itself does not forgive. Their fate hangs over you, a reminder that God's favor does not guarantee survival, and it explains the caution of Byzantine allies who will not easily welcome another mass of armed pilgrims. Still, hope stirs when talk turns to Constantinople. Rumors paint it as a city overflowing with domes, markets spilling in color and spice, and walls higher than mountains. For many, this vision becomes a reason to press on. The road may break bodies, but ahead lies a place that feels almost like salvation on earth. For some, it is the promise of bread and clean water. For others, it is the chance to see glory with their own eyes. But awe mixes with unease. Everyone knows the empire behind those walls has power to feed or starve the march. Whispers grow louder. Will the emperor treat these crusaders as guests or as intruders? Byzantine suspicion is no secret, especially after bands of undisciplined men left ruin behind them. In campfires, conversations turn sharper, the word ally carrying a note of question. Morning comes, and as you crest a ridge, the skyline opens. Towers and massive stone walls stretch far and high, gleaming white in the haze. Constantinople is nothing like the scattered towns you left behind. It is vast, ordered, and utterly beyond your grasp. Your heart surges at the sight, yet your breath catches too. Those gates may open, or they may close, depending not on prayer alone, but on negotiation. This is what the long road east has led to. Exhaustion, hunger, and the looming reality that faith alone cannot carry you through. Here, the crusade ceases to be only a pilgrimage. It becomes a question of politics, bargains, and trust between worlds. And as those colossal walls rise above you, you sense the real trial is about to shift from the march to the meeting. Constantinople did not greet you as a pilgrim. It tested you instead. Behind walls taller than any fortress you'd ever seen, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sat as master of supplies, ships, and survival. He did not speak of salvation. He asked for submission. His demand was clear. The Crusader leaders must swear an oath of fealty to him, pledging that any land taken from the Turks would return to Byzantium. Only then would he provide the grain, guides, and ferries needed for the army to continue east. To hungry men who had staggered through months of marching, the request felt both humiliating and necessary. You came for holy war, yet here your fate hinged on a political bargain. Most leaders bent first in argument, then in body. Godfrey of Bouillon stepped forward, choosing pragmatism over pride. Others followed, lips moving, hands clasped, words sworn, but not all. Raymond of Toulouse resisted, unwilling to yield fully, trying instead to phrase his oath in guarded terms. His hesitation revealed what lay at the heart of the crusade. Different men, different visions, held together by faith, but divided in ambition. The unease deepened when Alexios' envoys looked toward Bohemond of Taranto. To the emperor, Bohemond was no stranger but an old enemy, a Norman whose armies had once invaded Byzantine lands. If the Normans had attacked Byzantium before, what stopped them from carving out their own kingdoms again under a holy banner? Alexios' suspicion was not unfounded, and everyone in the hall could feel the tension as the Norman lord gave his grudging assent. The oath was sworn, but trust hung by a thread. Inside the great palace, the contrast was almost unbearable. Imagine marble floors polished smooth, golden mosaics glittering above, fountains gurgling in courtyards while you and your companions stood ragged, mud still drying on your boots. Crusaders were not greeting a fellow Christian ally in celebration. They were presenting themselves as dependents, bargaining for bread in an empire that regarded itself as older, richer, and more civilized. The imbalance was plain for all to see. Yet the bargain made sense from both sides. To Alexios, the Crusaders were swords without discipline, too dangerous to ignore, yet too useful to waste. Better to bind them by oath and use their zeal to claw back lost provinces. To the Crusaders, the emperor's stores offered what the road had already taken: food, coin, shelter, and ships that could carry them into Asia. Neither trust nor friendship was at stake, only survival and advantage. Still, the act of swearing bit deep into many hearts. You marched east with the cross, hoping your vows tied you to God alone. Now you found yourself tied, at least in words, to marble halls and a cautious emperor. Whispers in the camp called the oath a chain. Men muttered that Alexios would use them, drain them, then discard them. Others argued that refusing was folly, that starving outside the walls served no one. This was no betrayal in itself, but a deal where the holy met the worldly and blurred their boundaries. The camp beyond the gates told its own story. Crusaders fed on bread, whiter than any they had seen since leaving home. Barrels of dried meat and jars of wine came down from the city warehouses. Buckets of water splashed sweet and clean, so different from the stagnant puddles of the march. Along the docks, sturdy Byzantine ships waited, their sails ready to carry armies across the Bosporus. For the Crusaders who had clawed through mud and hunger, that vision was unavoidable. Without Alexios's bargain, they could not move forward at all. And yet suspicion lingered. Every loaf of bread seemed tinged with mistrust. Leaders stole glances at one another, judging which oaths had been sincere and which hollow. Rumors spread that Alexios meant to trick them, to herd them toward hopeless battles while reclaiming his empire with their blood. No proof was needed. Suspicion itself was enough to sow fractures. The crusade that had begun as one great cause now felt more like a gathering of men bound together only by need, each wary of the other. It left you questioning what the crusade had become. Was this still a pilgrimage born from Urban's call to penance? Or was it now a campaign warped into a puzzle of politics and power? You could feel both forces at once, men holding relics in prayer, and men calculating spoils not yet won. At times the two voices spoke in the same breath, faith and ambition clattering together in uneasy rhythm. When at last the oaths were finished and the ships loaded, you moved across the strait, the city walls shrinking behind you. Bread had filled your belly, but the shadow of the promise you made to Alexios stayed heavy. You had secured a way forward, yet not peace of mind. The bargain hung over your shoulder like armor you could not remove. What comes next will not be marble halls or ornate mosaics. It will be bare ground, parched air, and walls that hold out hunger for months at a time. You will soon stand before such a city, one that makes you wonder how long flesh and faith can hold together. What if the walls before you stretched so far they seemed endless, their towers defying every attempt to break them? This was Antioch. The siege began in October 1097, and from the moment you set camp outside its vast defenses, hopes of a quick victory dissolved. Months dragged on. Each day, hunger pressed more cruelly than any blade, and faith felt thin alongside the ache in your belly. The city was too large to seal completely. Antioch's defenders slipped supplies through hidden paths and narrow channels, while you scraped at weeds in frozen fields, gnawing them to keep from collapsing. Men dropped to the ground not from wounds, but from slow starvation. Graves filled shallow and fast, and still the living asked whether God was testing devotion or abandoning it outright. By January 1098, many had already perished, hundreds, possibly thousands by some reports, and desertion spread like a sickness of its own. Inside the camp, anger flared. Lords accused each other of mismanagement, soldiers muttered rebellion, and the unity once stitched by the cross frayed to threads. Quarrels broke around fire pits, some blaming cowardice, others demanding reckless assaults. To retreat meant disgrace, yet to remain promised death. Meanwhile, disease gnawed away further, hacking coughs, fevered shivering. Men carried to ditches after only a handful of days. Horses, once the pride of knights, staggered and collapsed until their hides were boiled for thin, bitter meals. At Antioch, survival forced men to devour not only all they had, but all they believed they would never touch. It was not only the city pressing on you. Reports came that new enemies marched. A relief force was gathering, intent on crushing the withered remnant outside Antioch's gates. You could feel doom tightening its grasp. The siege had become a trap, too weak to storm the towers, too shamed to flee, and too exposed if another army closed in. Under these strains, faith resurfaced as a weapon no enemy could blunt. Bishop Adhemar of Le Puy, the Crusade's spiritual shepherd, called the starving into fasts, even as stomachs howled empty. Processions wound barefoot around the perimeter, voices ragged in song, bodies shaking but still circling the camps. It was a paradox that defined the crusade, seeking strength by stripping strength further. And yet men obeyed, believing that only divine favor could break a city when steel and hunger could not. Then, in June 1098, chance opened the gates. Firuz, an Armenian commander inside Antioch, betrayed his post. By arrangement with Bohemond of Taranto, he allowed a small force through the walls. You followed in the dark, scaling ladders and pushing through an opening no battering ram had ever made. For months the city stood impregnable, yet it fell in a night through treachery. Once inside, the streets lit with torches and screams, and Antioch's defenders, Christian and Muslim alike, were slaughtered in the flood. But victory turned to peril almost immediately. Within days, Kerboga of Mosul arrived with a vast relief army. On June 4th, his forces encircled the same walls you had just seized. Now you faced what must have seemed unbearable irony, trapped inside the fortress you had bled for, once more gnawed by famine. This time there was no open countryside to forage. The city became your cage, and the enemy camped in every direction you could see. As hope thinned to its last thread, a moment arrived that reshaped everything. A humble visionary named Peter Bartholomew claimed to receive a vision from St. Andrew, revealing the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ's side, was buried beneath Antioch's ground. Digging began, and when a lance-shaped head was raised from the earth, men who had staggered near death became convinced God had spoken. Word of the relic cut through despair like thunder. Where ribs and hollow eyes had once spoken of defeat, now chance broke out with fevered force. Soldiers clutched the thought that heaven itself armed them. The relic's presence changed the army overnight. Faith, brittle for months, hardened into fanatic certainty. On June 28, 1098, driven more by conviction than by rations, the Crusaders marched out of Antioch in ordered battle groups. Bohemond and Adhemar led them forward against Kerboga's host, which far outnumbered their own. But numbers faltered before zeal. Crusaders fought with a frenzy as if God himself guided each strike. Against all expectation, the Muslim lines broke, and Kerboga's army collapsed in retreat. Against hunger, disease, and overwhelming odds, Antioch was held. This triumph, though, carried its own shadows. The leaders argued fiercely over who would claim the city, with Bohemond seeking it for himself. That discord stalled movement southward and made every step toward Jerusalem slower. Morale wavered again when Adhemar of Le Puy, the one bishop whose guidance united camp and commanders alike, died of illness on August 1st, 1098. His loss left the crusade without its clearest spiritual anchor, deepening divisions even as men dreamed of Jerusalem. Looking back at Antioch, you carry the memory of starvation, betrayal, revelation, and slaughter. You saw what the crusade became when bodies failed and belief had to rise in their place, how relics and visions could forge resolve where rations could not. Now the march continues. Southward the path stretches, and the city whispered since Clermont lies ahead. Its very name has haunted the air of every sermon and every mile. Soon those walls will rise before you, and the struggle will begin again under a searing sun. Imagine this: sun glaring off stone, ground split and dry, and a city that has lingered in every sermon since your first march, Jerusalem. By the time you stand before its walls in June 1099, the vast host that once left Europe has thinned to perhaps 12,000, with little more than 1,500 horsemen left. Every face carries hunger. Every body leans on grit more than strength. When the walls rise before you, they seem higher than any built by man could be, crowned with defenders who know exactly what your army seeks and what it will cost. Inside those walls, the Fatimid garrison rests behind strong stores of grain and water. Deep cisterns keep the defenders supplied even under siege. Outside, you and your companions parch in the sun, your water gone before midday, your food stretched to crumbs. There is no hope of another protracted trial like Antioch. With so few supplies, the choice is stark. Either breach the walls quickly, or collapse into dust beneath them. The army itself is divided. Godfrey of Bouillon, and Tancred encamp to the north. Raymond of Toulouse settles south. The split of command cuts sharp in the memory of every failed cooperation, and it shows. On June 13th, when the first assault rises up ladders, Raymond's force holds back. Arrows rain down unchecked, oil and fire drive attackers from the walls, and ladders crack under the heat. Bodies pile at the defenses, too many for a single day's effort. Spirits sag low. Some mutter that Jerusalem will become another graveyard of hope. But then comes a gift from the sea. Genoese mariners led by Guglielmo Embriaco haul timbers stripped from their ships up from Jaffa. They arrive with engineers, ropes, and tools, skills almost none among the host possess. Out of splintered ships grows the hope of towers. Now the camp reverberates with saws and hammers through the night. Sweat mingles with smoke as men labor by torchlight, each plank lifted onto rising siege engines. The creak of timber becomes a kind of prayer. Without ships sacrificed, no towers could stand. Faith itself is brought more directly into the siege. Peter Desiderius, a priest, claims a vision from the late Bishop Adhemar, instructing the Crusaders to purify themselves. So, on July 8th, barefoot processions trace a path around the ramparts. Dust grinds into wounds, but hymns lift once more, echoing back from the stone. At the Mount of Olives, Peter the Hermit preaches, and for a brief moment, rivalries fall silent. Soldiers who had cursed each other clasp hands. Fasting, prayers, and reconciliation bind the army closer than before. The ritual recalls Jericho, but more than symbol, it gives unity at the brink of collapse. By July 13th, the assault resumes. Towers roll forward, shields press tight, and ladders rise again. Defenders counter with searing oil, firebrands and stone hurled from on high. Men crouch beneath hides soaked in water, dragging siege frames inch by inch across the dust. The battle turns into a test of who can endure heat and fear longer. Shouts from the walls drive iron into skulls, but the towers grind onward. On July 15th, a tower touches stone on the northern front. Flames roar along the battlements, but the machine holds long enough for men to climb. Steel clashes above the walls as defenders lose footing. The line bends, then breaks. Crusaders clamber inside, boots sliding on blood and ash. Gates are thrown open, and Jerusalem itself lies exposed to the tide. Then comes the moment most remembered and most disputed. Eyewitness accounts speak of a massacre, streets running with death. Contemporary records describe Muslims and Jews cut down in homes, courtyards, and synagogues. Fires blaze through neighborhoods, smoke carrying above the dome. Yet modern historians caution about numbers, noting that later medieval sources may have exaggerated scale. Still, none doubt the slaughter's shock. The smell of burning and the cries of the defeated become the backdrop to prayers of thanksgiving as priests walk with relics raised high. Amid the chaos, surrender also shaped outcomes. The city's Fatimid commander, Iftikhar al-Dawla, negotiated to yield the citadel to Raymond's men in exchange for safe passage to Ascalon. Some inhabitants, especially Eastern Christians expelled before the siege, escaped the bloodshed entirely. Others found ransom bought survival, though not peace. Protection was offered in some corners, then broken in others. Tancred, for instance, tried to shield captives in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, though many of those prisoners perished in violence the next day. By nightfall, conquest was complete. Silver helmets gleamed through narrow alleys, corpses marked doorways, fires smoldered among stones that had heard prayers in countless tongues. To some, this was triumph. Jerusalem taken, God's city restored. To others, it was grim victory, the horror inseparable from the holiness. You climb to the wall itself and look out over the city below. The sermons of Clermont had spoken of salvation. Priests around you now speak of victory, yet the air carries the reek of blood and ash, a reminder that the cost of reaching Jerusalem was not only the road, but the city itself. The holy gates lie behind you, but the question of what they opened upon will not so easily be closed. And soon, The path will not lead forward, but away, from Jerusalem itself, back toward the world you left behind, to homes and fields that cannot understand what these walls have etched into you. The road bends back toward home carrying weariness instead of triumph. You arrive thinner, scarred, your steps slower. Hardship clings to you in ways no cloth can cover. Relics may hang from your belt, but it is memory that weighs most. The echoes of hunger, screams, and fire that sit heavier than armor ever did. When rooftops appear familiar again, the people rush to you. To them, your presence is proof of legend. Children stare at crosses still faintly stitched onto worn tunics. Elders raise hands in blessing. Villagers crowd to hear the tale of Jerusalem, eager for tokens that mark you as chosen. Many returning Crusaders were welcomed in this way, names hallowed in song. But others, those who came back early or never reached the holy city, were judged with harsher eyes. For those who endured to Jerusalem, praise was loud, yet inside the reception often felt out of step with what you carried home. Outwardly you tell the stories they expect, the march to the holy city, the gates forced open, the relics lifted high in the streets. Your listeners gasp and smile, convinced your suffering was a ladder to heaven, but as they celebrate, your own mind drifts elsewhere. You remember leather boiled for food, soldiers sinking into ditches, blood on stone streets that smelled not of sanctity, but of ash and flesh. The feast they set in welcome curdles your stomach, because the memory of hunger never really leaves. The promise that first stirred the march eastward remains, the remission of sin, heaven's reward. Kneeling again in the familiar church, you whisper fervent prayers for forgiveness. Yet obedience and unease sit side by side in you. When the priest declares victory, you hear cries of the dying. When villagers ask how triumph felt, you see again the fires consuming Jerusalem's quarters. The distance between their glory and your reality never seems to close. You have changed in ways neighbors cannot read. To them, your safe return confirms that the campaign was divinely favored. Yet you know pilgrimage turned to something harsher. You left as a farmer bound to work and custom. You returned as a veteran, marked by what conquest demanded. Faith endured, but it carries questions now, not answers. The crusade reshaped both body and spirit, branding you far deeper than any stitched cloth. News filters back about what was planted in the East. States carved from conquest and named as triumphs. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli. In your village, people speak of these as permanent emblems of faith's victory, but you know how slim their footing truly was. Only a small remnant of Crusaders stayed behind to guard them, just a few hundred knights with a thin line of infantry. Most marched back west, leaving fragile thrones hemmed in by powerful neighbors. You remember quarrels over spoils, rations stretched thinner than belief, and promises unkept. To you, those kingdoms seem less like triumphs than towers built on shifting sand. The praise of your countrymen begins to clang like a bell without tone. They call you hero, yet in silence you feel something more fractured. Deep down you wonder, did the expedition cleanse sins, or did it carve unforgivable scars with every life taken? Was this salvation earned, or penance without end? At times you fear the battles did not release you. They only entrenched guilt in a new way, securing heaven perhaps, but altering what it means to seek it. Transformation roots deep. Faith that once quickened your steps into departure hardens now into quiet endurance. Where once sermons inspired, memory now weighs heavier, teaching how fragile men become under thirst and cold. Understanding replaces certainty. Each choice bore cost, whether in flesh surrendered, spirit bent, or conscience pierced. These lessons resist the triumph painted in festival hymns. They are truths learned in fire and famine, truths much harder to share to crowds seeking simple victories. The thing is, return does not end the crusade. It lives on in each prayer you recite, each bell that tolls over your parish. You look up at the cross on the altar, and it no longer seems only a sign of penance. It has become a reminder, pulling every vision of siege and death back into your ears. Mass sounds different now, as though liturgy carries undertones of the road you took. The war remade landscapes in the east. It also remade the men who survived to come home. Seasons turn, and daily life reclaims its rhythm. You walk furrows with a plow, tend cattle, share harvest rites as before. Outward life seems ordinary, yet the clang of a far church bell twists you back in an instant to nights where bells meant alarm and fire. Memories remain unspoken, locked inside as burdens no one around you can bear. It is not their trial to shoulder. That silence belongs only to you. There is no hiding from the simple truth. Your days as a crusader are finished, but they have scarred and shaped you in ways invisible to those who never left. What was meant to bring unbroken assurance of heaven has left questions, wounds, and a harder kind of knowledge. The crusade reshaped not only Jerusalem or Antioch, but the souls of those who marched. And as you sit on familiar ground again, you realize the deepest journey was never about a city captured. It was about what faith endures when tested by hunger and fear, and how violently it can be bound to steel. These are the questions that stay with you now, pressing forward long after the campaign's banners have fallen. They set the stage for the harder truth still to come. Becoming a crusader was never only about conquest. It was about how faith collided with violence inside a single soul, tested through hunger, fear, and bloodshed. The cross on your chest gave purpose, but it also bound you to choices that blurred salvation with sin. The First Crusade left its imprint not just on the lands it seized, Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, but on the men who carried it out. Territories rose, yet those who returned carried scars as lasting as any stone fortress. Faith was won at the price of memory, and victory always came paired with cost. If this kind of close, human story of the past interests you, subscribe for more deep historical narratives.